The winter wind howled across the frozen fields of Belgium in December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge was about to begin, and thousands of Allied soldiers had no idea that Hitler's forces were preparing the largest German offensive of the war on the Western Front. Among these unsuspecting troops was a young American gunner whose story would become one of the most remarkable tales of survival and engineering marvel in military history. This is the story of how inadequate armor, desperation, and pure chance created a miracle that saved a man's life and changed the way military engineers thought about protection forever. The German 88mm anti-tank gun was the most feared weapon on the European battlefield. Its reputation preceded it like thunder before a storm. Tank crews would rather face almost anything else. Infantry soldiers learned to recognize its distinctive crack across the battlefield, a sound that meant something was about to be completely destroyed. The 88 could penetrate the armor of nearly every Allied tank at ranges that seemed impossible. It could bring down aircraft, it could demolish fortified positions, and it absolutely could end the life of any soldier unfortunate enough to be in its path. To understand why this weapon was so terrifying, we need to go back to its origins. The 88 began its life not as an anti-tank weapon, but as an anti-aircraft gun. German engineers in the 1920s and 30s were some of the finest in the world. They designed the 88 to shoot down high-altitude bombers, which meant it needed extraordinary velocity and accuracy. The barrel was long, the mechanism was precise, and the shells were powerful enough to reach targets flying at 20,000 feet. But then someone had a realization that would change armored warfare forever. If this gun could shoot projectiles with enough force to reach aircraft at extreme altitudes, what would happen if you pointed it horizontally at a tank? The answer was devastating. The 88mm shell traveled at nearly 3,000 feet per second. At that velocity, it could punch through 3 inches of steel armor from over a mile away. For context, most Allied tanks in the early years of the war had frontal armor between 1 and 2 inches thick. The 88 didn't just penetrate these tanks, it went through them like they were made of paper. German crews quickly learned to respect their weapon. It required a team of 11 men to operate effectively. The gun weighed 5 tons and could be towed behind a vehicle, then deployed in minutes. Once positioned, it became a predator lying in wait. Tank commanders who survived encounters with the 88 all said the same thing: you rarely saw it before it saw you. The first indication was usually the violent explosion as a shell tore through your vehicle. By the time the Allies landed in Normandy in June 1944, the 88 had become legendary. American, British, and Canadian tank crews had developed an almost superstitious dread of it. Intelligence reports estimated that a single, well-positioned 88 could stop an entire armored column. The psychological effect was almost as powerful as the physical one. Now, let's talk about American armor in 1944. The United States had entered the war with confidence in its industrial might, and rightfully so. American factories could produce tanks, aircraft, and weapons at a rate that staggered the imagination. The problem was that quantity doesn't always translate to quality, especially when you're facing an enemy that has been refining its weapons through years of combat experience. The standard American tank destroyer at this point in the war was the M10 Wolverine. It was based on the chassis of the M4 Sherman tank, but designed specifically to hunt enemy armor. The M10 had an open-topped turret, which made it lighter and faster than a fully enclosed tank, but this design choice would become critically important to our story. The armor on the M10 was deliberately thin. Military planners believed that tank destroyers should rely on speed and mobility rather than heavy protection. The front armor was just over 1 inch thick. The sides and rear were even thinner, sometimes less than an inch. The turret, where our gunner would sit, had armor that varied between 1/2 inch and 1 inch depending on the location. To anyone who understood what the German 88 could do, these numbers were terrifying. An M10's armor wasn't designed to stop an 88mm shell. It wasn't even designed to slow one down. The official doctrine was simple. Tank destroyers should use their speed to get into position, fire first, and then move before the enemy could respond. Don't get hit, because if you got hit by an 88, you weren't walking away. The crews knew this. They understood that they were riding in vehicles that offered minimal protection against the primary weapon they were likely to face. It created a specific kind of anxiety that never quite went away. You could be competent, well-trained, and experienced, but you were always aware that you were sitting in a metal box that wouldn't save you if things went wrong. Some crews tried to improvise. They welded additional plates onto vulnerable areas. They hung spare track links on the sides for extra protection. They even filled sandbags and positioned them inside the vehicle, hoping they might absorb some shrapnel. These modifications usually added weight without adding much real protection, but they did something important for morale. They gave the crews a sense of control, even if it was mostly psychological. Our story focuses on one particular M10 tank destroyer and its crew, operating with the American forces in Belgium as winter descended in 1944. The commander was a veteran of the North African campaign, a steady presence who had seen enough combat to know when to push forward and when to hold back. The driver was from Michigan, young but competent, with an uncanny ability to read terrain. The loader was built like a bear, which was essential given that each shell for the M10's main gun weighed over 40 pounds. And then there was the gunner. Let's call him Thomas, though his real name has been documented in various military records. Thomas was 22 years old, from a small town in Pennsylvania. He had grown up hunting in the Appalachian forests, which gave him an instinctive understanding of patience and precision. Before the war, he had worked in a steel mill, which meant he understood metal and how it behaved under stress. These skills made him an exceptional gunner. Thomas had joined his crew 6 months earlier, replacing a gunner who had been wounded in France. The integration had been smooth. He was quiet, focused, and reliable. The kind of soldier who did his job without drama, but never made mistakes when it mattered. His crew trusted him, which, in combat, was worth more than any amount of armor plating. In early December, their unit received orders to move into position near the German border. Intelligence suggested that the Germans were weakened, that the war was entering its final phase, that major offensives were unlikely. This assessment was catastrophically wrong. Hitler was preparing Operation Watch on the Rhine, which the Allies would later call the Battle of the Bulge. Over 200,000 German troops were about to surge through the Ardennes forest in a desperate attempt to split the Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. Thomas and his crew didn't know any of this as they positioned their M10 in a small Belgian village. The area seemed quiet. Local civilians were cautiously optimistic. The front lines had stabilized, or so everyone thought. The crew settled into a routine of maintenance and observation. They checked their ammunition, cleaned their weapons, and waited. The weather turned brutal. Snow began falling heavily, reducing visibility and making roads treacherous. This should have been a warning sign. The Germans had learned in Russia that bad weather grounded Allied aircraft, eliminating one of the Allies' greatest advantages. But the American commanders were focused on their own offensive plans further south. They missed the signals that something massive was building in the darkness across the German border. On the morning of December 16, 1944, the world exploded. The German artillery barrage began before dawn, a thunderous bombardment that shook the ground and shattered the winter silence. Thousands of shells rained down on American positions across a front that stretched for nearly 80 miles. It was the largest artillery barrage on the Western Front since D-Day, and it caught the American forces completely by surprise. Thomas and his crew were jarred awake by the explosions. For a moment, in that confused space between sleep and waking, it was hard to understand what was happening. Then, training took over. They scrambled to their positions in the M10, knowing that after artillery came infantry, and after infantry came tanks. The village descended into chaos. American soldiers who had been comfortable and relaxed were suddenly fighting for their lives. Units that had been scattered across wide defensive positions tried to consolidate. Communications broke down as German shells severed phone lines. Runners tried to move between positions, but many never arrived. Thomas's commander made a quick decision. Their position in the village was too exposed. They needed to fall back to a better defensive line where they could support the infantry without being isolated. The M10's engine roared to life, and they began moving through streets clogged with retreating soldiers and confused civilians. As they cleared the village and moved into more open terrain, Thomas caught his first glimpse of what they were facing. Through the snow and smoke, he could see German armor advancing, lots of it. Panzer, Mark IVs, Panthers, and in the distance, the unmistakable silhouette of Tiger tanks. This wasn't a local counterattack. This was a full-scale offensive. The crew found a position on a slight rise overlooking a crossroads. It wasn't ideal. They were somewhat exposed, but they had good visibility and clear fields of fire. The commander decided they would stay and try to slow the German advance, giving retreating American units time to establish better defensive positions further back. Thomas settled into his position behind the gun sight, his loader positioned shells within easy reach. The driver kept the engine running in case they needed to move quickly, and they waited. The first targets appeared within 20 minutes, a column of German half-tracks loaded with infantry. Thomas tracked them smoothly, waiting for them to reach the optimal range. His commander's voice was calm in his ear. Range, bearing, fire. The M10's main gun roared. The shell struck the lead half-track, which erupted in flames. The column scattered. German infantry deployed into the snow, seeking cover. The M10 fired again, destroying another vehicle, then a third. The crew was working efficiently, like a machine. Load, aim, fire, adjust, repeat. But Thomas knew this wouldn't last. They had announced their position. Every German soldier in the area now knew exactly where they were. And somewhere out there, enemy anti-tank weapons would be looking for them. He was right. Within minutes, German return fire began landing around their position. Mortar rounds exploded in the snow. Machine gun fire raked the area. The M10's open-top turret, which normally provided excellent visibility, now felt dangerously exposed. Shell fragments and bullets could drop straight down into the fighting compartment. The commander made a decision. They would fire one more engagement, then displace to a new position. It was standard tank destroyer doctrine: shoot and move. Never stay in one place long enough for the enemy to coordinate a response. Thomas acquired a new target, a German armored car moving toward their position. He adjusted his aim, compensated for range and wind, and fired. The shell struck true. The armored car stopped, smoke pouring from its engine compartment. Now, the commander ordered, move now. The driver began backing the M10 out of their position. They had just started to move when Thomas saw it. About 800 yards away, partially concealed by a destroyed building, a German anti-tank gun was being positioned. Even at this distance, even through the snow and smoke, Thomas recognized the profile immediately. An 88. He shouted a warning, but it was already too late. The German crew had spotted them. They had been tracking the M10, waiting for the exact moment when it would be most vulnerable. And that moment was now, as the American tank destroyer was backing up, its thinnest armor exposed. The 88 fired. What happened in the next 2 seconds would be analyzed by military engineers for years afterward. It would appear in training manuals and technical reports. It would become a case study in the unpredictable nature of combat and the sometimes bizarre ways that physics manifests in real-world conditions. The 88mm shell traveled the distance between the German gun and the American tank destroyer in less than a second. At that range, the shell was still carrying tremendous kinetic energy. It should have penetrated the M10's thin armor like a hot knife through butter. It should have passed completely through the vehicle, probably triggering an ammunition explosion that would have destroyed the M10 and eliminated everyone inside. But that's not what happened. The shell struck the M10's turret at an angle. This is important. If the shell had hit straight on, perpendicular to the armor surface, it would have punched through without difficulty. But combat is chaos. Vehicles are moving, gunners are adjusting, angles are never perfect. This particular shell struck the turret at approximately 30 degrees off perpendicular. The armor plate it hit was designated as a hardened steel alloy, standard for American armor production at that time. But this particular plate had a flaw. Not a catastrophic flaw, nothing that would have shown up in normal quality control inspections. It was a variation in the steel's internal structure, probably caused by inconsistent cooling during the manufacturing process. In peacetime, this variation would have been considered acceptable, within tolerances. The plate would have been classified as adequate for its purpose. This variation meant that the steel's hardness was not uniform across the plate. There were areas that were slightly harder than intended and areas that were slightly softer. Under normal circumstances, this wouldn't matter. But these weren't normal circumstances. When the 88mm shell struck the turret plate at that specific angle, with that specific amount of kinetic energy, it encountered the area where the steel was slightly harder than specification. The tip of the shell began to deform on impact, as any projectile does when it hits armor. But the angle and the unexpected hardness of the steel created a condition that armor designers call obliquity failure. Instead of penetrating cleanly, the shell began to deflect. The physics are complex, but the basic principle is simple. When a projectile hits armor at an angle, it wants to follow the path of least resistance. If the armor is hard enough and the angle is shallow enough, the projectile will sometimes slide along the surface of the armor rather than punching through it. It's similar to how a stone can skip across water if thrown at the right angle. The 88mm shell began to deflect upward along the curve of the turret. The hardened tip scraped across the steel surface, leaving a deep gouge, but not penetrating. The massive kinetic energy of the shell had to go somewhere. Part of it went into deforming the shell itself. Part of it went into creating heat and friction. Part of it went into transferring force through the armor into the interior of the M10. Inside the tank destroyer, the crew experienced something that felt like getting hit by a sledgehammer. The entire vehicle rang like a bell. The noise was indescribable, a metallic shriek that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Everyone inside felt the impact through their bones. The air itself seemed to compress from the shock wave. Thomas felt like he had been punched in the chest. His vision went white for a moment. His ears were ringing so loudly he couldn't hear anything else. He tasted blood in his mouth from biting his tongue. For a terrible second, he thought they had been penetrated, that the shell had come through the armor, and he was waiting for the secondary explosion that would end everything. But the explosion never came. The shell had deflected upward and away from the M10, tumbling through the air before impacting in the snow about 50 yards behind them. It exploded there harmlessly, sending up a fountain of frozen earth but hurting no one. The driver, operating on pure instinct and training, kept backing the M10 away from the German position. The commander was shouting something, but Thomas couldn't hear him over the ringing in his ears. The loader looked dazed, one hand pressed against the side of his head. They moved another 100 yards before taking cover behind a stone farmhouse. The entire crew was shaking. They knew what had just happened. They knew what should have happened. The difference between those two things was the difference between being alive and being gone. The commander was the first to recover enough to assess the damage. He climbed up to examine the turret exterior while the others caught their breath. What he found was remarkable. There was a deep gouge in the armor, a scar that ran for nearly 2 feet along the curved surface of the turret. The metal was peeled back in places, showing the layered structure of the armor plate. There were scorch marks from the heat of the impact, but there was no hole. The shell had not penetrated. The commander climbed back down and looked at his crew. They stared back at him, waiting for an explanation that he couldn't provide. What they had just survived shouldn't have been survivable. The math didn't work. An 88-millimeter shell at that range against that thickness of armor should have resulted in catastrophic penetration, but somehow, impossibly, they were still alive, and their vehicle was still functional. Thomas felt his hands shaking as the adrenaline began to wear off. He had faced death before. Every soldier in combat faces death. But this was different. This was being touched by death, and somehow not being taken. It created a strange feeling, part gratitude, part confusion, part a superstitious sense that something impossible had just occurred. The M10 was still combat capable. The engine ran smoothly. The transmission worked. The gun could traverse and elevate. The impact had been violent, but it hadn't disabled any critical systems. After a brief discussion, the commander decided they would continue fighting. American forces were falling back all along the line. Every functioning tank destroyer was desperately needed. Over the next 3 days, Thomas and his crew continued engaging German forces across the snow-covered landscape of Belgium. They fought delaying actions, ambushed advancing columns, and provided covering fire for retreating infantry. They saw the best and worst of combat. They saw incredible bravery and witnessed terrible losses. The gouge in their turret armor became something of a talisman for the crew. Other soldiers would see it when they stopped to refuel or rearm, and word spread. The M10 that survived in '88. The tank destroyer that shouldn't exist. Some crews thought it was lucky, others thought it was cursed, that it had used up all its luck in one impossible moment and now was living on borrowed time. Thomas didn't know what to think. He was a practical man, not given to superstition. He understood that what happened had been a combination of angle, armor properties, and pure chance. But he also understood that he had been given something that many soldiers never got, a second chance. The Battle of the Bulge would rage for another month. It would become the largest and bloodiest battle fought by American forces in World War II. Nearly 90,000 American soldiers would become casualties. Entire units would be surrounded and decimated. The weather would be brutal, the fighting desperate, and the outcome uncertain for weeks. Thomas and his crew survived the entire battle. Their M10 took more hits, though none as dramatic as that first 88-millimeter shell. They lost their driver to shrapnel wounds in late December. A young replacement from Ohio took his place, and the crew kept fighting. They participated in the defense of Bastogne from a distance, helping to break up German attacks on the road networks. They saw the weather finally clear on December 23rd, allowing Allied aircraft to begin devastating attacks on German supply columns. By mid-January, the German offensive had collapsed. The Wehrmacht had gambled everything on one massive push, and it had failed. The Allies were pushing back, reclaiming the ground that had been lost. The war was entering its final phase. When the M10 finally rolled into Maintenance Depot in early February, the mechanics and engineers who examined it were fascinated by the gouge in the turret armor. Word had spread about what happened, and now technical personnel wanted to understand how the impossible had occurred. The damaged armor section was carefully documented, photographed from every angle, and eventually removed for detailed analysis. Engineers from the Army's technical services examined the steel composition, the impact angle, the deformation patterns, and everything else they could measure. Their reports filled dozens of pages. What they found was both simple and profound. The armor plate had indeed had a minor variation in its heat treatment, creating areas of different hardness. This variation, combined with the specific angle of impact and the velocity of the incoming shell, had created conditions where deflection became possible. The 88mm shell had been traveling at such high velocity that when it encountered the harder area of steel and began to deform, it generated enough friction and heat to alter its trajectory. The engineers noted that this was not something that could be reliably replicated. It was not a design feature that could be incorporated into future armor. It was simply one of those rare moments when multiple variables aligned in just the right way to produce an unexpected outcome. In other words, it was luck. But it was luck explained by physics. The report concluded with a recommendation that armor manufacturing processes be examined to reduce variations in steel hardness, not because these variations could cause deflections, but because uniform armor performance was desirable for predictable protection. The engineers missed the larger point, but that was typical of technical reports. They focused on what could be measured and controlled, not on the human stories behind the data. Thomas returned home to Pennsylvania after the war ended in May of 1945. He rarely spoke about his experiences to anyone outside his family. Like many veterans, he found it difficult to convey what combat had been like to people who hadn't been there. How could you explain the sound of an .88 firing? How could you describe the sensation of being inside a metal box while high explosive shells tried to find you? How could you make someone understand what it felt like to survive something that should have ended you? He went back to work at the steel mill, which seemed almost surreal after everything he had experienced. The same building, the same machinery, the same work he had done before the war. But everything was different now. He understood steel in a way he never had before. He knew what it could do and what it couldn't do. He knew that the difference between life and death could come down to microscopic variations in a metal's internal structure. His crewmates stayed in touch through letters and occasional visits. They had shared something that created a permanent bond. They had looked into the face of death together and walked away. That kind of experience doesn't fade. It becomes part of who you are. The M10 that saved Thomas's life was eventually scrapped after the war, like thousands of other vehicles. Military equipment that had seemed so vital during the conflict became surplus almost overnight. The United States had an entire war's worth of tanks, aircraft, and weapons that were no longer needed. Most were sold for scrap metal or given away to Allied nations. But the story lived on. It appeared in military journals and training materials. It was used as an example in engineering courses. Decades later, when military historians began collecting first-hand accounts of the Battle of the Bulge, Thomas's story was included in several books and documentaries. The broader implications of this incident extended beyond just one crew's survival. Military engineers began thinking more carefully about armor angles and projectile deflection. The concept that armor protection wasn't just about thickness, but also about shape and angle, became more important in post-war tank design. The sloped armor that became standard on tanks in the 1950s and 60s owed something to lessons learned from incidents like the one Thomas experienced. Weapons designers also took note. If armor could deflect projectiles under certain conditions, then projectiles needed to be designed to minimize the chances of deflection. This led to developments in armor-piercing ammunition that featured harder tips, better penetration characteristics, and designs that were less likely to deflect even at shallow impact angles. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, military analysts conducted extensive studies of combat effectiveness. They examined thousands of engagements, trying to understand what worked and what didn't. The data showed something that many combat veterans could have told them. Survival in armored warfare often came down to factors beyond the control of the crew. Luck played a massive role. Training and skill mattered, But sometimes you could do everything right and still be struck down by a random shell. And sometimes you could be hit by a weapon that should destroy you and walk away. This statistical reality was uncomfortable for military planners who wanted to believe that better training and equipment could eliminate casualties. It suggested that combat would always have an element of chaos and randomness that could not be engineered away. Some crews survived horrible odds through pure chance. Others were lost in their first engagement through equally random misfortune. Thomas understood this better than most. He had been well-trained and competent. His crew had been professional and skilled. They had followed proper tactics and procedures, but none of that had saved them when the 88 fired. What saved them was a combination of physics, metallurgy, and timing that no one could have predicted or controlled. He had been lucky, and he knew it. As the years passed and Thomas grew older, he occasionally thought about that moment in Belgium. It never lost its intensity in his memory. He could still feel the impact, still hear that indescribable metallic shriek, still taste the blood from his bitten tongue. Time didn't dull those sensations. They remained vivid and immediate, as if they had happened yesterday. He wondered sometimes about the German crew that had fired the 88. They had done everything right. They had positioned their weapon well. They had waited for the optimal moment. They had aimed accurately. By all rights, they should have destroyed the American tank destroyer. But the shell deflected, and their target escaped. Did they realize what had happened? Did they understand that they had witnessed something unusual? Or did they just reload and look for the next target, accepting that in combat, not every shot connects, even when it should? There was no way to know. The German crew was anonymous, part of the vast machinery of war that ground up individuals and turned them into statistics. They might have survived the war. They might have perished in the retreat from Belgium. They might have been captured or wounded or simply disappeared into the chaos of Germany's collapse. The historical record didn't care about individual German anti-tank gunners. It had moved on to bigger questions about strategy and politics and the shape of the post-war world. But to Thomas, they were real. They had been sitting behind that 88, doing their job, trying to survive just like he was. For a fraction of a second, their lives and his had intersected in a moment of pure violence, and then they had diverged again, each side continuing their struggle through the winter wasteland of the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge itself entered history as Hitler's last major gamble in the West, a desperate offensive that achieved initial surprise and tactical success, but ultimately failed to achieve any strategic objectives. The German army lost thousands of men and massive amounts of equipment that could not be replaced. The Allies were delayed but not defeated. By late January, the situation had been restored, and the inexorable Allied advance toward Germany resumed. Historians would debate the battle's significance for decades. Some saw it as a meaningless waste that only prolonged the war. Others argued it demonstrated the resilience of Allied forces and the desperation of Nazi Germany. For the soldiers who fought there, these debates were abstract. They remembered the cold, the fear, the friends they lost, and the sheer intensity of combat that raged for weeks across frozen forests and snow-covered fields. Thomas represented thousands of similar stories that emerged from the battle. Every soldier who fought there had moments of terror, instances of incredible luck, memories that would never fade. His story was unique in its specific details, but universal in its broader themes. Combat was chaotic, survival was partly luck, and sometimes the difference between life and death came down to factors beyond anyone's control. The armor plate that deflected the 88mm shell was eventually melted down and recycled, its molecules mixed with countless other pieces of scrap metal from the war. The specific steel that had saved Thomas's life became part of bridges, buildings, and cars in the post-war reconstruction. In a sense, it continued serving even after its military purpose had ended. In the 1980s, when Thomas was in his 60s, a military historian contacted him to ask about his experiences. The historian was writing a book about tank warfare in the Battle of the Bulge and wanted to include first-hand accounts. Thomas agreed to be interviewed. Sitting in his living room in Pennsylvania, decades removed from the events, Thomas tried to put into words what that day had been like. The historian's tape recorder captured his voice, slightly rougher now with age, but still clear and measured. Thomas described the sound of the artillery barrage that began the German offensive. He talked about the confusion and fear as they realized the scale of what they were facing. He explained the tactical situation that led them to that particular position overlooking the crossroads, and then he described the impact. The historian noticed that Thomas's hands tightened on the arms of his chair as he spoke about it. Even after 40 years, the memory had physical power. Thomas explained how the entire vehicle had rung like a bell, how his vision had gone white, how he had been certain in that moment that he was about to experience his final second of life. The historian asked him if he thought the deflection was a miracle. Thomas thought about that for a long moment before answering. He said he didn't believe in miracles in the religious sense, but he did believe that sometimes things happened that couldn't be easily explained. The shell hit at exactly the right angle, struck exactly the right spot on the armor, and deflected in exactly the right way. Change any one of those variables by a few degrees or a fraction of an inch, and the outcome would have been completely different. Was that a miracle? Or was it just the random alignment of physical forces? Thomas said he didn't know, and he didn't think it mattered. The result was the same. He had lived. He had come home. He had built a life after the war. However you wanted to explain how he survived that moment, he was grateful for it every day. The historian's book was published in 1987. Thomas's story occupied several pages in a chapter about tank destroyer operations during the battle. The book sold modestly and was well reviewed in military history circles. Thomas bought a copy and read his own words preserved on the page. It felt strange to see his experience transformed into historical narrative, cleaned up and contextualized, and made part of the larger story of the war. He gave the book to his children, hoping they might understand a bit more about what he had gone through. They read it with interest and pride, though he suspected they still couldn't truly grasp what it had been like. How could they? They had grown up in peacetime, in a world made possible by the war their father had fought. The darkness and violence of that conflict was history to them, something that happened in books and documentaries, not something that shaped every day of their father's life. Thomas passed away in 1994 at the age of 72. He had lived a good life after the war, married, raised children, worked steadily, and enjoyed his retirement. The war was always with him, but it didn't define him entirely. He was more than just a gunner who survived an 88mm shell. He was a husband, a father, a worker, a neighbor, a man who lived fully in the decades given to him after that frozen morning in Belgium. At his funeral, one of his former crewmates gave a eulogy. They had stayed close through all the years, bound by what they had shared. The former loader, now elderly himself, spoke about Thomas's calmness under fire, his skill as a gunner, and his loyalty as a friend. He mentioned the deflected shell, but only briefly. It was part of Thomas's story, but not the whole story. The technical analysis of the armor deflection remained in military archives, occasionally referenced in papers about armor design and projectile physics. Engineering students at military academies sometimes studied it as an interesting case of unexpected material behavior. The incident became a footnote in the larger history of World War II armored warfare. But the human story, the experience of 4 men in a tank destroyer who survived something unsurvivable that resonated beyond technical specifications and historical analysis. It spoke to something fundamental about the nature of combat and survival. It reminded people that war, for all its strategic planning and tactical precision, ultimately came down to individual human beings in moments of extreme danger, where outcomes could hinge on factors beyond anyone's control. The legacy of that moment extended in ways both obvious and subtle. Directly, it influenced armor design philosophy and gave engineers data about real-world performance under combat conditions. Indirectly, it became part of the collective memory of those who studied the Battle of the Bulge and tried to understand what soldiers experienced during that terrible winter. For every battle, there are thousands of individual stories. Most are never recorded. The soldiers who experience them return home, carry their memories privately, and eventually pass away without anyone documenting what they witnessed. History remembers the generals and the strategies and the major turning points, but the individual moments of terror and survival often vanish without a trace. Thomas's story survived because he agreed to be interviewed, because a historian recognized its significance, and because the technical aspects were interesting enough to warrant official documentation. But how many similar stories were lost? How many other crews survived impossible situations through luck and circumstance? How many soldiers had their own moments where death came within inches but somehow missed? These questions are unanswerable but important. They remind us that the vast historical narratives we construct about wars are built on millions of individual experiences, most of which remain unknown. The Battle of the Bulge killed nearly 20,000 American soldiers and wounded or captured another 70,000. Each of those casualties had a story. Each survived engagement had a story. The sum total of human experience during those 6 weeks of winter fighting in 1944 and 45 is beyond any historian's ability to fully capture. What we can do is preserve the stories we do have. Thomas's account of the deflected shell gives us a window into the experience of combat, the randomness of survival, and the ways that soldiers processed near-death experiences. It's valuable not just for its technical details, but for its human authenticity. When Thomas described his hands shaking after the impact, when he talked about tasting blood from his bitten tongue, when he recalled the moment of certainty that he was about to perish, he was giving us something that no strategic analysis or after-action report could provide: the lived reality of combat. The M10 tank destroyer as a weapon system had a mixed reputation by war's end. It was effective in some roles and inadequate in others. Its thin armor remained a persistent problem. Crews never quite reconciled themselves to riding in vehicles they knew couldn't protect them from the primary threats they faced. The open-top turret, while providing excellent visibility, left them vulnerable to artillery and mortar fire. By 1945, military planners were already designing next-generation tank destroyers that would address these limitations. But for all its flaws, the M10 served. Thousands were produced. They fought on multiple continents. They participated in every major American campaign from North Africa to the fall of Germany. Crews learned to work within the vehicle's limitations, developing tactics that maximized its strengths while minimizing exposure to its weaknesses. They became skilled at shoot and move operations, at selecting good firing positions, at knowing when to fight and when to retreat. Thomas and his crew exemplified this professional competence. They weren't reckless. They didn't take unnecessary risks. They followed doctrine and used their training. And when the impossible happened, when that 88mm shell struck their turret and somehow deflected instead of penetrating, they didn't freeze or panic. They kept moving, got to cover, assessed the damage, and continued fighting. That steady professionalism under extreme stress was what won battles and ultimately wars. The deflection itself, while remarkable, was ultimately a statistical inevitability. Fire enough shells at enough targets under enough varying conditions, And eventually something improbable will occur. Projectiles will hit at unexpected angles. Material properties will vary in unforeseen ways. Physics will manifest in surprising combinations. The universe is probabilistic, and rare events do happen. But that knowledge doesn't diminish the impact for the individuals who experience these rare events. For Thomas and his crew, it didn't matter that from a statistical standpoint, some armor deflection somewhere was mathematically likely. What mattered was that it happened to them in that specific moment when their lives hung in the balance. The probability calculation was academic. The survival was personal and immediate. This tension between statistical reality and individual experience runs through all of combat history. Military planners think in terms of casualty rates and probability of success. Individual soldiers experience each moment as unique and irreducible. Both perspectives are valid, but they operate on different scales. Strategy requires the former. Human comprehension demands the latter. In the decades following World War II, as military technology advanced and weapons became more sophisticated, the fundamental randomness of combat survival remained. Improved armor, better weapons, enhanced training, all of these reduced casualties and improved the odds. But they never eliminated the element of chance. Modern soldiers still survive situations they shouldn't survive. They still fall to attacks that seemed unlikely to succeed. Combat retains its chaotic nature despite all attempts to control and predict it. Thomas's story reminds us of this truth. It shows us that behind every military engagement, behind every statistic and every strategic analysis, there are human beings experiencing moments of raw survival. These moments are rarely neat or explicable. They don't follow predictable patterns. They emerge from the collision of intention, circumstance, and pure random variation. The gouge in that turret armor, carefully photographed and preserved in official records, stands as a monument to this truth. It's physical evidence of an impossible moment, a tangible record of survival against overwhelming odds. Military museums have similar artifacts, helmets with bullet holes that should have been fatal but weren't, fragments of shrapnel removed from soldiers who somehow lived, pieces of equipment that failed in one way but succeeded in another. These artifacts tell stories that numbers cannot fully convey. They connect us to the human experience of war in ways that battlefield maps and casualty figures do not. When you look at that gouge in the armor, when you trace its path and understand what it represents, you're touching a specific moment in time when everything hung in the balance and somehow resolved in favor of life rather than death. For Thomas, that gouge represented a gift. He never forgot that he was given something that many of his fellow soldiers were not: more time. He returned home, lived his life, raised his family, and carried always the knowledge that he had been granted decades that he might very easily not have had. That awareness shaped how he lived. It made him more patient, more grateful, more conscious of the preciousness of ordinary moments. His children remembered him as a steady presence, not given to drama or excessive emotion. He worked hard, paid his bills, maintained his home, and participated in his community. From the outside, he seemed like any other working man in small-town Pennsylvania. But those who knew him well understood that beneath that ordinary exterior was someone who had looked directly at death and understood its reality in a way most people never do. The war changed everyone who fought in it, but it changed them in different ways. Some returned angry and bitter. Some returned damaged, unable to reconcile what they had experienced with the peacetime world. Some returned and tried to forget, burying their memories and refusing to speak about what they had been through. Thomas found a middle path. He didn't forget, but he also didn't let the war consume him. He acknowledged that he had been shaped by his experiences, but insisted on continuing to grow and change beyond them. The deflected shell was part of his story, but it wasn't the end of his story. He lived another 50 years after that frozen morning in Belgium, and those years mattered just as much as the moment of survival that made them possible. When historians look back at World War II, they see the vast sweep of events, the rise of fascism, the global conflict, the turning points and decisive battles, the ultimate Allied victory. This macro view is essential for understanding the war's causes, conduct, and consequences, but it can obscure the individual human experiences that constitute the war's true substance. Thomas's story pulls us back from the macro view to the micro reality. It reminds us that the war was fought by individuals, each with their own perspective, their own moments of terror and relief, their own struggles to survive and make sense of chaos. These individual stories collectively form the war's real history, the history that statistics and strategies can only approximate. The Battle of the Bulge, in particular, was composed of thousands upon thousands of these individual stories. American soldiers, many of them young and inexperienced, suddenly thrust into the largest battle they would ever fight. German soldiers, knowing their nation was losing but fighting with desperate ferocity anyway, Belgian civilians caught between two armies in the dead of winter. Each person experienced the battle differently, saw it from their own unique vantage point, carried their own memories forward. Some of these memories were of horror, comrades lost, terrible wounds, the sight and sound and smell of combat that could never be forgotten. Some memories were of courage, acts of selfless bravery, units holding against impossible odds, leaders rising to extraordinary challenges. And some memories were of moments like Thomas experienced, when fate balanced on a knife's edge and somehow, inexplicably, tilted toward survival rather than oblivion. These are the memories that define war for those who fight it. Not the grand strategies or the historical significance, but the personal, immediate, visceral experiences that mark them forever. Thomas carried his memory of the deflected shell for his entire life. It never left him. It shaped how he saw the world and his place in it. In the end, his story is about more than just armor and projectiles and the physics of deflection. It's about the fragility of human life, the role of chance in survival, and the ways that soldiers carry their war experiences forward into peacetime. It's about how one moment, one impossibly lucky moment, can grant decades of additional life. And it's a reminder that history is not just about the big events and famous names. It's also about ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, people like Thomas who did their duty, survived against the odds, and then returned home to live quiet lives that history rarely records, but that mattered profoundly to everyone who knew them. The deflected shell was a moment of physics and metallurgy, but it was also a moment of grace, a moment when death reached out and somehow missed. Thomas understood this, even if he couldn't fully explain it. He had been touched by something beyond explanation, and he spent the rest of his life being grateful for it. That gratitude, that awareness of having received an unearned gift, informed everything he did in the decades that followed. It made him a better father, a better husband, a better friend. It gave him perspective on what truly mattered. It taught him that life is precious, precisely because it is fragile and can be lost in an instant. These lessons, learned in the frozen fields of Belgium in December 1944, stayed with Thomas until his final days. And through stories like his, they stay with us, reminding us of the cost of war, the value of peace, and the thin line that often separates survival from destruction. The armor plate may have been weak by military standards, but on one winter morning it was exactly strong enough. And that made all the difference.